The first sound was not an argument. It was the soft, electronic chime of a boarding scanner rejecting a pass that had already been accepted once. The line stalled. A ripple of irritation moved through the jet bridge like a held breath finally exhaled. At the front, a gate agent frowned at her screen, tapped twice, then looked up at the man standing calmly in front of her. "Sir, can you step aside for just a moment?" The man did not protest. He did not sigh. He simply shifted one step to the right, making room for the next passenger, even though the next passenger was not invited forward. He held his leather carry-on by the handle, fingers relaxed, knuckles steady. No tremor, no rush. Behind him, a woman muttered something about missing her connection. Somewhere deeper in the aircraft, an engine whined, low and constant, like a reminder that time was already being lost. The man's name was Daniel Harper. He was 58 years old, tall but not imposing, grey threaded neatly through close-cropped hair, a navy jacket worn soft at the elbows, shoes polished but not new. He looked like a man who had learned long ago that drawing attention was rarely worth the cost. The gate agent glanced at his boarding pass again. First class, seat 2A, Boston to San Francisco. Everything correct. She smiled tightly. "Just 1 second, sir. Our system is recalibrating." Recalibrating meant nothing. Daniel knew that. Everyone who had flown long enough knew that. It was a word used to buy time, to decide, to weigh something unspoken. A man in line leaned forward, voice sharp. He already boarded. "What's the problem?" The agent didn't answer him. Her eyes slid back to Daniel, then past him, toward the waiting area where two figures stood apart from the crowd. They did not look angry. That came later. Right now, they looked expectant. Robert and Elaine Whitaker had been flying this route for decades. Their faces carried the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being accommodated without asking. Robert's blazer still bore the faint crease of a tailor who charged more than most people's first cars. Elaine held her purse close, one manicured hand resting on the strap, as if claiming territory. They were watching Daniel. Not with hostility, with assessment. Elaine leaned toward the agent and said something Daniel could not hear. Her lips barely moved. The agent nodded once. Daniel felt it then. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. The subtle shift in air when a decision is made without you in the room. "Sir," the agent said, lowering her voice, "we're just going to have you wait here for a moment longer." Daniel met her eyes. "Is there an issue with my seat?" She hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. "Just a minor adjustment, sir. It won't take long." Behind her, the jet bridge door remained open. Boarding had stopped entirely now. Conversations died down. People watched, pretending not to. Daniel nodded. Of course. Of course was a word he had learned to use carefully. It sounded compliant. It sounded harmless. It also bought him time to think. He thought of another airport, decades earlier. A smaller plane, a cheaper suit. The same word spoken by someone else. Of course. And how that moment had ended with him in a middle seat he had not paid for, staring at a window that belonged to someone who had decided he deserved it more. He shifted his weight slightly. The floor beneath his shoes vibrated as luggage was loaded below. A second agent approached, older, late 40s, maybe early 50s. Her badge read Karen Mills, supervisor. "Mr. Harper," she said, already holding his boarding pass, "we're going to need to clarify something before you proceed." Daniel did not ask how she knew his name. He knew. His pass had been scanned. His information was already in her hand. Clarify what, exactly? Karen gestured toward the waiting area. "We have long-standing priority guests on this flight who are assigned their usual seats. There seems to have been a system overlap." System overlap. Another empty phrase. Daniel followed her gesture. Robert and Elaine were closer now. Not crowding him. Not yet. But near enough that he could smell Elaine's perfume. Subtle. Expensive. Robert spoke first. His voice was calm, practiced. We fly this route twice a month. Always the same seats. Always. Daniel nodded once. I'm sure you do. Karen's smile thinned. We're just asking you to wait while we make sure everyone is accommodated appropriately. Appropriately was doing a lot of work. Daniel glanced back at the plane. Through the open door, he could see the first row of seats, white headrests, empty glasses waiting. A place that had already been decided was his, until it wasn't. How long will this take? He asked. Karen checked her watch. Just a few minutes. A few minutes was how long it took for irritation to harden into something else. Behind Daniel, someone cleared their throat loudly. Another passenger rolled a suitcase forward, then stopped short. The line was frozen, and everyone knew exactly why. Elaine finally spoke. You understand, of course, that some of us have medical considerations. Daniel looked at her, directly, calmly. I'm sorry to hear that. She blinked. Not the response she expected. Karen stepped in quickly. We'll take care of everything, Mrs. Whitaker. Daniel noticed the ease with which Karen said her name. Familiar. Rehearsed. Karen turned back to him. Mr. Harper, we may need to reseat you temporarily. There are excellent options available. Full compensation, of course. Daniel inhaled slowly. The smell of jet fuel drifted in from outside. Somewhere on the tarmac, a vehicle beeped as it reversed. Temporarily, he repeated. Yes. To where? Premium economy at first. Until we can resolve. Daniel raised a hand. Not high, not dramatic. Just enough to stop the sentence. I paid for seat 2A. I selected it. I confirmed it. I'm on time. I'm compliant with every boarding requirement. There is nothing to resolve. The words were measured, even. No accusation, no edge. Karen's jaw tightened. Sir, we're trying to avoid a delay. Daniel looked past her, down the jet bridge, at the people waiting. The quiet frustration, the small movements, the weight of being watched. So am I, he said. Robert exhaled sharply. This is getting unnecessary. Daniel turned to him. With respect, sir, this became unnecessary the moment my seat became a negotiation. Simon's fell hard, the kind that presses on the ears. Karen's smile disappeared completely. Mr. Harper, if you're unwilling to cooperate, this could become more complicated than it needs to be. There it was, the shift. The line crossed without being named. Daniel felt his pulse steady rather than spike. He had learned, over years and boardrooms and courtrooms, that calm unnerved people who expected deference. I am cooperating, he said. I am simply not agreeing to something I did not cause. Karen glanced toward the terminal, toward a phone mounted on the wall, toward a choice she did not want to make, but felt entitled to. Please remain here, she said. Do not move forward. Daniel nodded once. Of course. The word landed differently this time. Behind the scenes, unseen by anyone in the jet bridge, a notification would soon be sent. A quiet flag, a compliance alert tied not to a name, but to a pattern. But for now, Daniel Harper stood exactly where he was told, holding a bag that weighed almost nothing, while an entire aircraft waited, unaware that the next 28 minutes were about to change far more than a seating chart. The jet bridge clock ticked forward without mercy, each second stretching thin as tension settled into the narrow space like stale air. Daniel Harper remained exactly where Karen Mills had left him, one step from the threshold of the aircraft, close enough to hear the muted hum of the cabin, but barred from crossing it. His posture did not change, shoulders relaxed, chin level. The kind of stillness that came from discipline, not surrender. Behind him, impatience began to rot into irritation. A man in his 70s shifted his weight and muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another passenger checked her phone, then checked it again, as if time might obey her glare. A flight attendant leaned out from the doorway, her expression strained, eyes flicking between Daniel and the growing line behind him. Karen returned with a tablet tucked under her arm and a new tightness in her face. The practiced warmth was gone now. What replaced it was procedural firmness, the tone of someone who believed authority alone should resolve resistance. "Mr. Harper," she said, "we need to keep this process moving." Daniel did not turn immediately. He listened to the cadence of her voice, the subtle shift in emphasis. She was no longer asking. She was preparing to document. "I agree," he said. "The process should move forward." Karen glanced down at her tablet. "I'm authorized to offer you a seat in premium economy, row 7, aisle. You'll receive a full refund of the fare difference and additional travel credit." She angled the screen slightly toward him, as if proof of generosity might compel gratitude. Daniel finally turned to face her fully. "Row 7 aisle, yes." He nodded once. "And seat 2A will be reassigned." Karen hesitated. "Temporarily." "Temporarily implies a return," Daniel said. "Is that being guaranteed?" Karen's fingers tightened around the tablet. "Sir, we are doing everything we can to accommodate everyone." "That is not an answer." A quiet murmur passed through the line, the kind that grows when people sense a confrontation moving past politeness into principle. Robert Whitaker stepped forward, his voice clipped. "This shouldn't be so complicated. We've done nothing wrong." Daniel looked at him. "I haven't either." Elaine sighed, loud enough to be heard. "Some people just don't understand how these systems work." Daniel felt that one land. He did not react outwardly. Inside, he catalogued it carefully, the way he had learned to do with statements that revealed more than they intended. Karen raised a hand slightly, signaling calm. "Mr. Harper, if you refuse to accept the reassignment, I'll have to note you as non-compliant with crew instructions." Non-compliant. The word was chosen deliberately. A flag, a category. Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "Please note whatever you feel is accurate. I will do the same." Karen frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I am also documenting this interaction." Elaine's eyebrows lifted. "Are you threatening us?" "No," Daniel said. "I'm preserving facts." A pause stretched. The engine noise seemed louder now, a low mechanical growl underscoring the standoff. Karen stepped aside and spoke quietly into her headset. Daniel caught fragments. Delay, seating dispute, yes. Passenger refusing downgrade. Refusing downgrade. Another phrase that shifted responsibility without changing reality. The flight attendant near the door cleared her throat. "Boarding needs to resume." Karen turned back. "Mr. Harper, this is your final opportunity to resolve this amicably." Daniel inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The movement was small, but deliberate. Amicable resolution would involve me taking my assigned seat. That option appears to have been removed without my consent. Karen's mouth tightened. "I'm going to ask you once more to step aside." Daniel did not move. Around them, silence sharpened. No phones were out yet, but eyes were fixed. Attention had weight now. A man several rows back said quietly, "He's not wrong." Karen ignored him. "Sir, failure to comply may result in further action." Further action was left undefined. That was the point. Daniel's voice dropped slightly, not softer, just lower. "Are you suggesting that I will be removed from this flight?" Karen blinked. "I'm saying we need cooperation." Daniel nodded. Cooperation does not mean capitulation. That was the moment something changed. Karen's radio crackled. She glanced down, listened, then looked back up with a new expression. Controlled, but strained. "Corporate is asking for clarification," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. About the nature of the dispute." Daniel gestured gently toward the aircraft door. "It's about whether a confirmed seat is honored or overridden by preference." Karen did not respond. She stepped aside again, speaking into the radio in a low voice. Daniel heard the word priority, heard the phrase frequent flyers, heard his own name spoken carefully, as if being tested. Behind the scenes, systems were already pulling threads. Purchase history, loyalty tiers, complaint records. Not to identify him, but to assess risk. A process designed to protect the company, not the passenger. Elaine leaned toward Robert and whispered something sharp. Robert shook his head, jaw clenched. This was taking longer than expected. Daniel felt his phone vibrate once in his jacket pocket. He did not check it. Not yet. Timing mattered. Karen returned again, this time with a man Daniel had not seen before. Mid-40s, dark suit, no airline insignia. His presence alone shifted the temperature. "Mr. Harper," the man said, extending a hand that Daniel did not immediately take. "I'm James Keller, operations liaison." Daniel nodded politely, but did not shake the hand. "Mr. Keller." James withdrew his hand without comment. "We understand there's a disagreement regarding seating." Daniel looked at Karen, then back to James. "There is no disagreement. There is a request for me to give up something I paid for." James smiled faintly. "We prefer to think of it as flexibility." Daniel's phone vibrated again, this time twice. "Flexibility is voluntary," Daniel said. "This is not." James glanced toward the Whitakers, then toward the watching passengers. "We need to clear the jet bridge." Daniel's tone remained even. "Then honor the boarding pass." James exhaled slowly. "Sir, if we allow exceptions—" "This is not an exception," Daniel interrupted quietly. "It is the rule." James studied him more closely now. The calm, the control, the refusal to escalate. It was unsettling. "May I ask what you do for a living, Mr. Harper?" Daniel met his gaze. "I manage risk." That answer lingered. James's radio buzzed. He turned slightly away, listening. His expression shifted, just a fraction. "Understood," he said into the radio. "Yes, I'll handle it." He turned back. "Mr. Harper, I need you to step with me for a moment." Daniel shook his head once. "No." James frowned. "This will make things easier." "For whom?" James hesitated. "For everyone." Daniel's phone vibrated a third time. He reached into his pocket now and glanced at the screen. A single-line message. Received. Proceed. He slipped the phone back without reacting. James followed his movement. "Is there someone you'd like to call?" "Already done." Karen stiffened. "Sir, personal calls are not permitted during boarding." Daniel looked at her. "Neither is selective enforcement of seating contracts." A low murmur rippled through the crowd again, this time louder. James's patience thinned. "Mr. Harper, we can escalate this." Daniel nodded once. "So can I." James studied him, then turned away, speaking urgently into his radio. The words legal and compliance slipped through. Time moved differently now. Faster, heavier. Somewhere far from the jet bridge, a compliance officer opened a file that had not been accessed in years. Somewhere else, a risk algorithm flagged an anomaly, not because of Daniel Harper, but because of repetition. Pattern over incident. Karen glanced at the clock. "We are already 20 minutes behind schedule." Daniel looked at the same clock. 20 minutes since you rejected my boarding pass." James's phone buzzed. He read the message, then read it again. His face drained slightly of color. He looked at Daniel with something new in his eyes. Caution. "Mr. Harper," he said carefully, "we're going to pause boarding temporarily." Daniel nodded. "That seems prudent." James swallowed. "Please remain where you are." Daniel remained exactly where he was, as the aircraft doors stayed open. The line held its breath, and an invisible mechanism began to turn, one that would not stop simply because someone finally sat down. The pause was supposed to calm things. Instead, it sharpened them. Boarding screens flickered from boarding to delayed. A soft chime echoed down the jet bridge, followed by the low collective groan of passengers who had seen this movie before and never liked the ending. Someone laughed once, short and humorless. Another person muttered a curse under their breath. Daniel Harper did not move. James Keller stepped a half-pace away, speaking urgently into his phone now, no longer pretending this was routine. Karen Mills stood rigid, tablet held to her chest like a shield. Her eyes avoided Daniel's, not out of shame, but calculation. She was already rehearsing explanations. Documentation mattered. Language mattered. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. Behind them, Robert Whittaker's patience snapped. "This is absurd," he said loudly. "You're holding up an entire flight over one seat." Daniel turned to him slowly. "No. One decision." Elaine touched her husband's arm. "Robert." He shook her off. "Don't tell me to calm down. This man knows exactly what he's doing." Daniel studied him, the flushed face, the trembling jaw, the fear masquerading as indignation. "I know what I'm refusing," he said. Karen interjected quickly. "Sir, please lower your voice." Robert laughed sharply. "Lower my voice? I'm not the one causing a scene." Daniel felt something shift again. Not in him, in the space around him. The word scene had weight. It always did. A man near the back of the line spoke up. "He's been calm this whole time." Karen shot him a look. "Sir, this does not concern you." "It concerns everyone," the man replied. "We're all stuck here." James returned, phone still in hand. "We're escalating this to regional operations." Daniel nodded. "As you should." James frowned. "You seem very confident." Daniel met his gaze. "Confidence comes from clarity." Karen leaned closer to James and whispered something Daniel could not hear. He caught only one word: liability. James's jaw tightened. At the open door of the aircraft, a flight attendant named Claire watched from just inside the cabin. She was young, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and hands clasped too tightly in front of her. She had seen situations like this before. They never ended cleanly. Someone always paid a price, usually the wrong person. Her gaze flicked to Daniel. He noticed. He offered her a small nod. Not reassurance, recognition. She swallowed and looked away. James turned back to Daniel. "Sir, until we resolve this, I'm going to need you to step off the jet bridge." Daniel did not respond immediately. He let the request sit in the air, heard it for what it was. Step off the jet bridge meant removal, without saying removal. "On what grounds?" he asked. James hesitated. "Operational necessity." Daniel's lips pressed together briefly. That phrase again. Empty, but powerful. "I will not leave voluntarily," he said. Karen's voice hardened. "Mr. Harper, refusing a direct instruction." "Is this a lawful instruction?" Daniel asked calmly. Karen faltered. "It is a company instruction." Daniel nodded once. Then no. The murmur behind him grew louder now. Phones came out, subtle at first, then less so. Elaine noticed. Her eyes darted. "Robert, people are filming." Robert stiffened. "This is ridiculous." James's phone buzzed again. He turned away, his back to Daniel now, voice low and urgent. He nodded several times. "Yes, understood. I'll relay that." He turned back slower this time. "Mr. Harper," he said carefully, "may I ask if you've ever flown with us before?" Daniel considered the question. "Many times." James glanced at Karen, then back. "And have you ever had an issue?" Daniel met his eyes. "That depends on what you consider an issue." James exhaled. "Corporate wants to know if there's been prior dissatisfaction." Daniel's gaze was steady. "Corporate has access to every complaint I've ever filed."
"I suggest they review the ones I didn't."
James frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means silence is not consent." The words landed heavier than Daniel intended, or perhaps exactly as intended. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Harper, let's not make this adversarial." Daniel looked at her. "It became adversarial when my rights became optional." James's phone vibrated again. This time he did not answer immediately. He stared at the screen, eyes narrowing, then lifting slowly to Daniel's face. "How long have you held your current position, Mr. Harper?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Which one?" James blinked. "Your job." Daniel's voice remained even. "Long enough to know when a process has failed?" James swallowed. "And what process would that be?" "The one designed to ensure equal treatment." Behind them, Claire shifted her weight. She leaned toward another attendant and whispered. The other attendant shook her head quickly, fear in her eyes. Karen noticed. She turned sharply. Claire back inside the cabin. Claire obeyed, but not before Daniel saw the conflict on her face. Guilt, fear, resolve fighting quietly. James stepped closer to Daniel, lowering his voice. "Sir, if this escalates further, security may need to get involved." Daniel nodded. "Security exists to enforce safety, not preference." James's jaw clenched. "You're putting us in a difficult position." Daniel's gaze did not waver. "I'm standing in the position you put me in." Silence pressed down again, thicker now. The jet bridge felt smaller, the walls closer. A voice crackled over the overhead speaker, filtered and distant. "Attention, please. Boarding for this flight has been temporarily suspended. We appreciate your patience." Patience was running out. Elaine whispered urgently to Robert. "This is getting out of hand." Robert snapped back. "It shouldn't have come to this." Daniel heard her then. Not the words, the fear underneath. The sudden realization that this was no longer controlled. James's phone buzzed again. He answered immediately. "Yes, I understand. Yes, I'll inform him." He ended the call slowly. "Mr. Harper," he said, choosing his words with care. "Regional Compliance is reviewing this incident as a potential procedural breach." Daniel nodded. "That's appropriate." Karen's face drained of color. "Procedural breach." James continued. "Until that review is complete, we're placing this aircraft on a temporary operational hold." The words hung there. A woman in line gasped. Someone swore softly. Phones came fully up now, no longer hidden. Operational hold meant something different than delay. It meant oversight, scrutiny, records opened. Robert stared at James. "You can't be serious." James did not look at him. This is no longer a seating issue. Daniel remained still. The faintest muscle in his jaw tightened, then released. James looked at him again, his voice quieter now. "Sir, is there anything you'd like to add for the record?" Daniel thought of his father. Of all the moments that passed unchallenged, because challenging them would have cost too much. Of all the people who learned to swallow injustice, because it was easier. "Yes," he said. "Please note that this began before anyone raised their voice." James nodded slowly. Somewhere, far away, beyond the jet bridge and the watching crowd, a compliance dashboard updated in real time. A line turned red. Another followed. The system had not yet identified Daniel Harper, but it had recognized the pattern. And once patterns are seen, they cannot be unseen. The first sign that something had gone irreversibly wrong was not raised voices or flashing lights. It was silence from the other end of James Keller's phone. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, thumb hovering, as if hoping the message might rewrite itself. Around him, the jet bridge had become a narrow theater. No one spoke loudly anymore. They didn't need to. The tension carried on breath alone. Karen Mills was the first to break. "James, what does that mean? Operational hold?" James did not answer immediately. His eyes were still on Daniel Harper, as if the man standing calmly in front of him had become a variable he had failed to account for. "It means," James said finally, "that this situation is no longer under local discretion." Karen swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. "And what exactly triggered that?" James exhaled through his nose. "A pattern review." The word landed like a quiet detonation. Daniel felt it then, the shift from confrontation to consequence. This was the point of no return, where the story stopped belonging to the people present and began belonging to systems, records, and people who would never set foot on this jet bridge. Behind him, a woman whispered, "What does that mean?" Another voice answered softly, "It means lawyers." Robert Whittaker laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "This is insane! Over a seat." James finally turned to face him. "Sir, please remain where you are." Robert stiffened. "Don't talk to me like—" James cut him off, firm now. "This applies to everyone." Elaine's face had gone pale. She leaned closer to her husband. "Robert, maybe we should just let it go." "Let it go," Robert snapped. "They're humiliating us." Daniel heard the word humiliation and felt its familiar weight. He did not turn. He did not react. He had learned long ago that humiliation, when acknowledged, multiplies. Karen stepped closer to James, lowering her voice. "This doesn't make sense. We followed procedure." James met her eyes. "Which one?" She blinked. "The loyalty accommodation guidelines." James shook his head slightly. "Those are discretionary. What compliance is reviewing is consistency." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Her face flushed. Consistency was the word no one wanted to hear. Claire emerged again from the aircraft, drawn by instinct rather than instruction. She stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped behind her back, eyes darting between the growing crowd and Daniel's still figure. James noticed her. "Claire, please return to your station." She hesitated. "Just a moment." James's patience thinned. "Now." Claire turned, but not before Daniel caught her eye again. This time, she didn't look away. James addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are experiencing a brief delay while we resolve an internal matter. You will be updated shortly." Internal matter. Another careful phrase. Phones were fully out now. No one hid them anymore. People didn't need to. Once a delay crossed a certain threshold, recording became self-justifying. Karen glanced at Daniel. "Sir, would you be willing to step back into the terminal while this is reviewed?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I was instructed to remain here." Karen's jaw tightened. "That instruction no longer stands." Daniel looked at James. Does it? James hesitated, for a fraction of a second too long. No. Daniel nodded. Then I'll stay. Karen's voice rose slightly. You're being unreasonable. Daniel turned to her for the first time since the hold was announced. His gaze was steady, not angry, not cold, simply present. I am being consistent. That word again. Karen looked away. James's phone vibrated once more. He answered immediately. Yes, understood. I'll inform them. He lowered the phone slowly, then spoke, each word measured. Regional compliance has escalated this to corporate oversight. They've requested a temporary suspension of all departures pending review of active complaints. A murmur rippled through the jet bridge, louder now. All departures. Someone gasped. Another laughed in disbelief. Elaine grabbed Robert's arm. Robert, what did they just say? Robert's face had drained of color. That's not possible. James nodded once. It is. Karen stared at him. You can't ground an entire airline for this. James did not look at her. This isn't about this. Daniel felt the weight of it then. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Responsibility. The knowledge that once a lever is pulled, you don't get to choose how far the machine moves. James cleared his throat. Mr. Harper, corporate would like to know if you intend to file a formal complaint. Daniel considered the question. Around him, people leaned in. This was the moment they would remember. The soundbite, the decision. Yes, he said. I already have. James's eyes widened slightly. Already? Daniel nodded. The documentation was submitted when boarding was paused. Karen's breath caught. Submitted to whom? Daniel looked at her. The appropriate parties. James studied Daniel now with something close to awe. You planned this? Daniel shook his head once. I prepared for it. There was a difference. Robert stepped forward, his voice shaking. This is completely disproportionate. You're costing thousands of people their travel plans. Daniel turned to him calmly. And how many people have quietly paid that cost before today? Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. Elaine's eyes filled with tears, though whether from fear or anger was unclear. James spoke again, quieter now. Sir, corporate is requesting your availability for a call. Daniel nodded. Of course. Karen stared at him. Who are you? Daniel did not answer immediately. He took out his phone, checked the time, then looked back up. Someone who knows how these systems work. James gestured toward a quieter corner of the jet bridge. Please. Daniel took one step, then paused. He looked back at the line of passengers, the faces etched with frustration, curiosity, and something else. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. This did not begin with me, he said. It won't end with me either. James nodded slowly, as if he understood that more than he wanted to. As Daniel moved to the side, Karen stood frozen in place. The tablet slipped slightly in her hands. On its screen, a red banner blinked steadily. Review in progress. Somewhere far from the jet bridge, in a glass conference room overlooking a different runway, executives stared at dashboards lighting up in rapid succession. Delays, complaints, correlations. And in that narrow corridor between terminal and aircraft, where a single decision had been challenged, the machinery of accountability began to grind forward, indifferent to comfort, immune to excuses, and very, very awake. The call did not begin with greetings. Daniel Harper stood near the frosted glass wall at the edge of the jet bridge, phone pressed to his ear, while the low murmur of stranded passengers swelled behind him. James Keller hovered a few steps away, close enough to hear Daniel's voice, but far enough to pretend he wasn't listening. "This line is being recorded," a calm voice said on the other end. "Please state your name for the record." Daniel did not hesitate. "Daniel Harper." "Thank you, Mr. Harper. This is Eleanor Price, Corporate Compliance Officer for Liberty Skies Airlines. We understand there has been a disruption during boarding." "Disruption," Daniel said quietly, "implies spontaneity." There was a pause. Then, "Please describe the sequence of events from your perspective." Daniel spoke without embellishment. He described the rejected scan, the request to wait, the introduction of loyalty preference, the offer of downgrade, the suggestion of non-compliance, the implied removal. Each detail placed carefully, like evidence laid out on a table. As he spoke, Karen Mills paced several feet away, her face tight, eyes darting between Daniel and the growing cluster of passengers now openly filming. Every few seconds, her tablet vibrated. She did not look at it. "Thank you, Mr. Harper," Eleanor said when he finished. "For clarity, were you ever informed that your seat assignment was invalid?" Number: Were you informed of any safety-related justification for reassignment? No. Were you provided written documentation outlining the policy under which this request was made? No. Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Harper," Eleanor continued, "may I ask if you are aware of any prior incidents involving similar requests on this route?" Daniel's gaze drifted toward the open aircraft door, where Claire stood just inside, her posture rigid, her face pale. He remembered the nod she had given him earlier, the silent acknowledgement. "I am aware that patterns do not begin with me," Daniel said. "They persist because they are tolerated." James shifted his weight. Karen stopped pacing. "Understood," Eleanor said. "Please remain available." The call ended. James exhaled slowly. That didn't sound like a routine inquiry. Daniel met his eyes. It wasn't. James rubbed his forehead. "I need to update operations." Karen rounded on them. "You can't just let this spiral." James snapped back, quieter but sharper. "It already has." Karen's voice trembled. "We followed guidance." "Loyalty accommodation has been standard practice for years." James looked at her. "Informal practice is not policy." Karen opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Her eyes flicked to Daniel. Something in her expression changed then. Not anger. Fear. A voice rose from the line behind them. "So, what happens now?" James turned. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. At this time, boarding will remain paused. We are coordinating next steps." "That's it!" someone shouted. "That's all you've got?" James nodded. "For now." A man near the front shook his head. "This airline used to be better." Daniel felt that one. Not because it was true or false, but because it carried disappointment rather than outrage. Claire stepped forward unexpectedly. "James." He turned sharply. "Claire, I told you, I know," she said quickly. "But they're asking questions inside the cabin. People want to know why we're sitting here." James hesitated, then nodded once. "Tell them we're awaiting compliance review," Claire swallowed. "And if they ask why?" James glanced at Daniel, then back to her. "Tell them we're addressing a concern about equal treatment." Claire's eyes widened slightly. Equal treatment. She nodded and turned back toward the aircraft, her steps measured but purposeful. Karen watched her go, jaw clenched. "She's going to say too much." James didn't respond. Daniel's phone vibrated again. He checked the screen. A single-word message from a number he knew well. Active. He slipped the phone away. James noticed. Active. Daniel looked at him. Compliance has opened a live case. James closed his eyes briefly. Jesus. Karen whispered, "What does that mean?" James spoke carefully. "It means this is no longer being evaluated as an isolated incident." Karen's face went ashen. "Then what is it?" James met her gaze. "It's being evaluated as systemic exposure." The word exposure hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Behind them, the boarding display flickered again. Delayed. Then something new appeared. Hold for review. A ripple moved through the crowd. Phones rose higher. Whispers sharpened. Robert Whittaker pushed forward, his composure cracking. "This is out of control. You can't just shut everything down." James turned to him. "Sir, please step back." Robert laughed bitterly. "You think this looks bad now? Wait until shareholders hear about this." Daniel spoke without turning. "They already have." Silence dropped fast and hard. Elaine grabbed Robert's sleeve. "What does that mean?" Robert stared at Daniel. His voice lowered. "Who are you?" Daniel turned slowly this time, not with menace, with gravity. Someone who has seen what happens when systems are allowed to drift. James's phone rang. He answered immediately. "Yes, understood. I'll relay that." He ended the call and looked at Daniel, then Karen, then the crowd. "Corporate has issued a temporary ground stop for all Liberty Skies departures, pending immediate audit." The words landed like a physical force. A woman gasped. Someone cursed loudly. Another laughed, stunned. Karen staggered back a step. "All departures." James nodded. "Nationwide." Robert's face drained of color completely. Elaine clutched his arm. "Robert, what did you do?" He shook his head. "This isn't our fault." Daniel finally turned fully to them. "This is not about fault. It's about consequence." James addressed the crowd, raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we understand the frustration this causes. Ground staff will be available to assist with rebooking and accommodations. Further updates will follow." The words sounded small against the magnitude of what had just been announced. Karen sank onto a nearby bench, tablet slipping from her grasp. On its screen, red alerts stacked one over another. Audit initiated. Staff actions under review. Immediate compliance measures required. She stared at the screen, as if it might dissolve if she looked long enough. James looked at Daniel. "Corporate would like to speak with you directly. Video call." Daniel nodded. "Of course." As James guided him toward a quieter alcove, Daniel glanced back once more. At the passengers. At Claire, standing rigid in the doorway. At Karen, hands trembling, staring at the consequences of choices she had never questioned. This did not feel like victory. It felt like gravity finally asserting itself. Somewhere beyond the terminal, planes sat motionless on tarmac across the country, engines silent, schedules collapsing. Not because one man refused to move, but because a system had been forced to stop pretending it didn't know where it was going wrong. Daniel stepped into the alcove as the video call connected, his reflection briefly visible in the darkened glass. Calm, controlled, unyielding. And far above the noise of the terminal, a larger conversation had begun, one that would not end when this flight finally did. The screen came alive without ceremony, no logo, no pleasantries. Just a row of faces, framed by fluorescent boardroom lighting, each one carefully composed, each one measuring the man standing alone on a jet bridge in Boston. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harper," said a woman with steel-grey hair pulled tight behind her ears. "My name is Diane Holloway. I chair the Interim Compliance Committee." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Ms. Holloway." Around her, others shifted. A man in his 60s adjusted his glasses. Another tapped a pen against a legal pad, the sound sharp even through the speaker. Somewhere off-screen, papers shuffled. "We understand you initiated a formal complaint moments before boarding was suspended," Diane continued. "We want to hear directly from you." Daniel did not rush. He took in the room, the posture, the distance, the fact that none of them asked how he was doing. "I initiated documentation," he said. "The complaint exists because the behavior existed." A pause, controlled, deliberate. "Please describe what you believe warrants a nationwide ground stop," another voice said. Male, tired, defensive. Daniel's gaze did not flicker. "The ground stop is not my decision." "Then why are we here?" the man pressed. "Because your systems escalated it," Daniel replied. "Not because of one interaction, but because of repetition." Diane leaned forward. "Explain that." Daniel did. Not emotionally, structurally. He spoke of how discretion becomes habit, how habit becomes culture, and how culture eventually leaves fingerprints everywhere. He spoke of loyalty programs quietly mutating into entitlement pipelines, of how frontline staff learn not from policy manuals, but from which decisions get rewarded and which ones get ignored. As he spoke, the man with the pen stopped tapping. "You're suggesting this is institutional," someone said. "I'm stating it is patterned," Daniel replied. "Whether you call that institutional is a legal question." Another pause. Longer. Ms. Holloway folded her hands. "Mr. Harper, are you aware that this airline employs over 40,000 people?" "Yes." "And that a full ground stop impacts tens of thousands of passengers daily?" "Yes." "Then help us understand why this response is proportionate." Daniel's voice dropped slightly. Not softer, heavier. Because incremental responses protect the system, not the people inside it. Silence followed, the kind that meant the answer had landed where it was meant to. On the jet bridge, James Keller stood frozen a few feet away, pretending to review updates on his phone. He was not pretending very well. Every word carried. Karen Mills sat with her head in her hands, elbows on her knees, staring at nothing. She had stopped receiving updates. That was worse than bad news. Inside the cabin, Claire moved slowly down the aisle, answering questions she could not truly answer. "We're waiting on corporate. Please remain seated." "Yes, I know it's frustrating. I'm sorry." She said sorry more times in 5 minutes than she had in the previous month. Back on the screen, a new face appeared. Younger, sharper, legal counsel. "Mr. Harper," the attorney said, "we need to be clear. Are you alleging discrimination?" Daniel looked directly into the camera. "I am describing it." The attorney stiffened. "Words matter." "So do patterns," Daniel replied. Diane Holloway raised a hand. "Enough." She turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Harper, if we proceed with a full audit, it will be invasive. Personnel actions will follow. Careers will be affected." Daniel nodded. "Accountability has impact. You understand that this could include frontline employees." Daniel's gaze softened for the first time. "I understand that systems fail downward." Diane studied him. "And yet you proceeded." Daniel did not look away. "Because systems only change when pressure moves upward." Another silence, heavier than the last. Diane exhaled. "We are considering appointing an external oversight firm." Daniel nodded. "That would be appropriate." The attorney frowned. "You seem very comfortable advising us." Daniel's mouth curved slightly. "I've spent my career helping organizations confront risks they preferred not to see." "And what organization would that be?" the attorney asked. Daniel paused, just long enough. "I serve as managing partner of Harper North Capital," Daniel said. We oversee long-horizon infrastructure and transportation investments. The boardroom shifted. Harper North, the man with glasses murmured. That's... Yes, Diane said quietly. That Harper North. Recognition moved across the screen like a wave. Controlled expressions faltered. Calculations adjusted. You have a financial stake in Liberty Sky's parent company, the attorney said slowly. Daniel nodded once. Along with fiduciary obligations. Diane's eyes sharpened. You didn't mention that earlier. You didn't ask, Daniel replied. James Keller's breath caught audibly behind him. The attorney leaned back. So this is also a conflict of interest. Daniel shook his head. It's alignment of responsibility. Diane held up a hand again. Let's be precise. Mr. Harper, are you leveraging your position to force action? Daniel met her gaze steadily. I'm exercising it to prevent harm. The distinction hung there, daring them to challenge it. Diane exchanged looks with the others. Finally, she spoke. The ground stop will remain in effect until the preliminary audit concludes. Daniel nodded. That is your decision. We will also place several staff members on administrative leave pending review. James flinched. Karen's shoulders slumped further. Claire paused mid-aisle, eyes lifting instinctively toward the jet bridge, as if she felt the shift before she heard it. Diane continued. Mr. Harper, would you be willing to serve as an external advisor during this process? Daniel considered the question carefully. His answer came slower than the rest. I will not advise from inside your structure, he said. But I will not disappear either. Diane nodded. Fair. The attorney cleared his throat. One final question. What outcome are you seeking? Daniel looked past the screen, past the jet bridge, past the terminal windows where planes sat motionless under a pale afternoon sky. I want the next person in my position to never have to decide whether dignity is worth the delay. The screen went quiet. Diane Holloway nodded once. Understood. The call ended. Daniel lowered the phone. Around him, the jet bridge felt different now, less tense, more stunned. James Keller finally spoke. You grounded an airline. Daniel shook his head. Your systems did. Karen looked up, eyes glassy. I was just doing my job. Daniel met her gaze. Then this is the moment to decide which job that was. She looked away. In the cabin, Claire leaned against a bulkhead, eyes closed briefly, then opened them with resolve. She straightened her uniform and continued down the aisle. Across the country, planes remained where they were, engines cooling, schedules unraveling. News alerts began to buzz. Analysts began to speculate. Shareholders began to ask questions they had postponed for years. Daniel Harper stood alone at the edge of a jet bridge, the noise of an airport swelling around him, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. Change, real change, never arrived with applause. It arrived with scrutiny, and it demanded you stand still while everything else stopped. The first headline broke before anyone on the jet bridge was officially told. A vibration rippled through the terminal as phones lit up almost in unison, screens glowing in aging hands, in nervous hands, in hands that had been gripping armrests and ticket folders for too long. A woman near the window whispered, "They've grounded Liberty Skies." A man beside her laughed once, disbelieving, then went quiet when he read further. Daniel Harper felt the shift without looking. He had spent enough years in rooms where information changed the temperature. The air grew heavier, louder, charged with the kind of attention that doesn't fade quickly. James Keller read the alert over Daniel's shoulder. His face tightened. Nationwide operational pause. pending compliance audit. He swallowed. That's already public. Daniel nodded. It always is. Karen Mills stared at her tablet again, but the screen no longer showed internal alerts. It showed the same newsfeed everyone else was seeing. Her name wasn't there. Not yet, but the language was close enough to feel like a hand at her throat. Inside the aircraft, Captain William Ross emerged from the cockpit. Early 60s, broad shoulders softened by years of routine. His eyes took in the frozen scene in seconds. He had flown through storms that shook metal and nerve alike. This was different. James moved toward him. "Captain." Ross raised a hand gently. "I heard." He stepped onto the jet bridge, his presence quiet but grounding. "Folks," he said, voice steady, "I'm aware this delay has extended beyond reasonable expectations. At this time, operations has instructed us to stand down until further notice." Someone shouted, "How long?" Ross didn't dodge it. "I don't know." That honesty did more than any rehearsed apology. A few shoulders lowered, a few curses softened. Claire stood just behind him, her eyes rimmed red but focused. She caught Daniel's gaze again, held it this time, then looked away as if something inside her had settled. Ross turned to James. "What exactly are we looking at?" James hesitated. "Compliance review, corporate oversight." He glanced at Daniel, then back to the captain. "It's bigger than this flight." Ross nodded slowly. "It always is." Karen pushed herself to her feet. "This is out of proportion," she said, voice cracking. "We're being judged in real time without context." Daniel turned to her. "Context is built from patterns, not intentions." She looked at him. Really looked this time. "You could have just taken the other seat." Daniel's reply was immediate. "And you could have honored the one I paid for." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They landed where Karen's defenses were thinnest. She shook her head. "You don't understand how this works." Daniel studied her. The strain etched into her face. "I understand exactly how it works. That's why I didn't move." A man near the front of the line spoke up. "My wife flew this airline last year. Got bumped from her seat without explanation. I thought it was a one-off." Another voice followed. "Same thing happened to my brother. Different route." The murmurs grew, stories overlapping, details aligning. What had felt like inconvenience was reassembling itself into recognition. Ross listened, his jaw tightening. He turned to James. "You hear that?" James nodded. "I do." Karen's shoulders sagged. "This isn't fair." Daniel looked at her. Fairness rarely feels fair to the system that avoided it. James's phone buzzed again. He answered quietly, then looked up. "Corporate is asking that passengers be given the option to deplane." A ripple of reaction moved through the group. Relief for some, resentment for others. Ross addressed the crowd again. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you choose to exit the aircraft, ground staff will assist with rebooking or accommodations. If you prefer to remain, we ask for your patience." A few people immediately moved. Most stayed. Not because they believed the flight would leave soon, but because they wanted to see what happened next. Daniel noticed Robert Whittaker standing apart now, his earlier bluster gone. Elaine whispered urgently to him, her face tight with worry. They no longer looked offended. They looked exposed. Robert glanced at Daniel, then looked away quickly. James stepped closer to Daniel. "Media is calling corporate. They're asking for comment." Daniel nodded, as they should. James hesitated. "They'll want to hear from you." Daniel's voice was calm. "They will, when the time is right." Ross studied him. "You seem remarkably prepared for this." Daniel met his gaze. "I've learned that when systems resist change, they test resolve." Ross nodded once, a flicker of respect passing through his eyes. Karen spoke again, softer now. "What happens to us?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He considered her question as if it mattered. Because it did. "What happens depends on what you do next," he said. "Accountability is not punishment, it's direction." She swallowed. "And if I'm found at fault?" Daniel's voice was quiet. "Then you decide whether to defend a habit or correct it." Karen closed her eyes briefly. Claire approached Daniel cautiously. "Mr. Harper?" Daniel turned. "Yes?" She hesitated, then spoke. "I've seen this before. Not like this, but the way decisions get made, who gets accommodated, who gets pressured." Daniel listened. She continued, voice trembling but steadying. "I told myself it wasn't my place." Daniel nodded. "That's how patterns survive." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "I don't want to be part of that anymore." Daniel's reply was gentle. "Then don't be." James watched the exchange, something shifting behind his eyes. He cleared his throat. "I should inform corporate that you're willing to speak publicly." Daniel nodded once. "When they're ready to listen." Across the terminal, a television mounted near a coffee stand switched to a breaking news banner. "Liberty Skies grounds all flights amid internal review." The anchor's voice cut through the ambient noise, urgent and incredulous. Passengers gathered around the screen. Some shook their heads, some nodded slowly. A few smiled grimly. Ross looked at the planes through the window, lined up in stillness. "I've been flying for 30 years, he said quietly. "Never seen anything like this." Daniel followed his gaze. Change rarely announces itself politely. James's phone rang again. He answered, listened, then handed it to Daniel. "They want you live." Daniel took the phone. He did not rush. He looked once more at the jet bridge, at the people who had become unwilling participants in something larger than their travel plans. "This is Daniel Harper," he said into the phone. A voice responded, fast, eager. "Mr. Harper, can you confirm?" Daniel interrupted calmly. "I can confirm that a system paused itself today. That's all." There was a pause on the other end. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "When a system has to stop to examine itself, that's not chaos. That's accountability." He handed the phone back to James. Karen sank back onto the bench, hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time, she wasn't trying to control anything. Ross addressed the cabin once more. "Thank you for your patience. We'll continue to update you as information becomes available." As he turned back toward the cockpit, Daniel caught his eye. "Captain." Ross paused. "Thank you for not escalating this," Daniel said. Ross nodded. "Thank you for not backing down." Outside, the afternoon light shifted as clouds moved across the sky. Planes remained grounded, schedules unraveled. Somewhere, in offices far removed from the human weight of this moment, executives argued over language and liability. But on a jet bridge in Boston, surrounded by ordinary people who had just watched an extraordinary pause, Daniel Harper stood quietly, knowing that the hardest part of change was never forcing the stop. It was deciding what moved again when everything else had been forced to wait. The call they were waiting for did not come from the airline. It came from Washington. James Keller answered it instinctively, then froze mid-sentence. His posture changed first, straightened, still. He listened longer than anyone liked, murmured acknowledgements, then ended the call without looking at anyone. Captain Ross noticed immediately. He had flown long enough to recognize the look of someone who had just been reminded how small their authority really was. James cleared his throat. Federal Transportation Oversight has been notified. They're requesting documentation within the hour. The jet bridge seemed to contract around the words. Federal meant timelines. Federal meant records that could not be massaged. Karen Mills closed her eyes. Her voice came out thin. This is no longer internal. James shook his head. It stopped being internal when it repeated itself. Daniel Harper leaned against the glass, arms relaxed at his sides. He did not smile. He did not look vindicated. His gaze stayed on the tarmac where planes sat motionless, their polished skins catching the dull afternoon light. A woman near the boarding door spoke quietly. My husband worked for the railroads back in the 70s. He used to say the government only steps in when everyone else looked away for too long. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the truth without owning it. Inside the cabin, Claire moved from row to row, answering questions with the same steady cadence. No, we don't have a departure time yet. Yes, accommodations are being arranged. I understand the frustration. Her voice never rose, but her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the overhead bins. In the cockpit doorway, Captain Ross spoke low to his first officer. They're asking for my statement too, about cabin procedures. The first officer grimaced. This goes back years. Ross nodded. And that's the problem. James's phone buzzed again. He checked it, then exhaled sharply. Corporate is issuing a formal statement. They're acknowledging procedural failures. Karen looked up. Already? James nodded. Media pressure is moving faster than legal. Karen's shoulders slumped. We were told to protect the brand. Daniel turned slightly toward her. Brands are protected by behavior, not silence. She looked at him, something breaking through her defenses. I didn't wake up this morning thinking I'd be part of this. Daniel's voice softened, but did not lose its edge. No one who maintains a system ever does. A man in his late 60s approached hesitantly. He wore a veteran's cap, hands folded around it. Excuse me, sir. Daniel turned. Yes? I just wanted to say, I served in the Air Force, flew transport planes. We had rules for a reason. When you start bending them for convenience, people get hurt. Maybe not today, but eventually. Daniel met his gaze. Thank you for saying that. The man nodded and stepped back into the crowd. James glanced at his watch. We need to start moving passengers off the aircraft. Some of them have medical needs. Ross nodded. I'll make the announcement. He stepped inside the cabin and spoke into the intercom, his voice steady but heavy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are arranging for deplaning for those who wish to exit. Please remain seated until instructed. As people began to stand, the jet bridge filled with motion again. Slow, careful. Conversations overlapped, no longer sharp, but weighted. Robert Whittaker stood awkwardly near the wall, his earlier confidence completely gone. Elaine clutched her purse as if it were an anchor. Robert finally spoke to Daniel, his voice low. This went too far. Daniel turned to him fully. Did it? Robert swallowed. You didn't have to let it escalate. Daniel's eyes held his. Escalation happens when early corrections are refused. Elaine interjected, desperation creeping in. We didn't know this would happen. Daniel nodded. That's how privilege usually works. Robert flinched. That's not fair. Daniel's reply was immediate. Neither was asking me to move. Robert had no answer. Karen approached James quietly. What happens to me? James didn't sugarcoat it. There will be a review. You'll have representation. But yes, you'll be named. She nodded slowly, absorbing it.
I was trying to keep things smooth. James looked at her. Smooth isn't the same as right. Claire returned from the cabin, eyes tired but resolute. People are upset, but some of them, they're talking, sharing stories. It's like they've been waiting for permission. Daniel felt that settle in his chest. Stories waited. They always did. His phone vibrated. He checked it. Another message. Oversight confirmed. Hearing scheduled. James noticed. You're being called in. Daniel nodded. I expected that. Karen's eyes widened. A hearing? Daniel looked at her. Accountability requires daylight. Ross emerged again, removing his cap, running a hand through his graying hair. I've been instructed to secure the aircraft. We're done flying today. A murmur moved through the group. Some sighed, some cursed.
A few nodded, resigned. Daniel watched as passengers filed out, their footsteps echoing against the metal floor. Each one carried a version of the story now. Each one would tell it differently. A woman paused near Daniel. Thank you, she said quietly. My mother used to say nothing changes because good people stay quiet. Daniel inclined his head. Your mother was right. James walked Daniel toward the terminal entrance. You understand this won't end cleanly. Daniel nodded. Change never does. As they reached the threshold, James stopped. I have to ask, if you hadn't been who you are, would you have still stood there? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes. James frowned. Why? Daniel looked back at the jet bridge, now emptying, stripped of tension but not of consequence. Because dignity isn't situational. It either exists or it doesn't. James exhaled. You know they'll come after you too. Daniel met his gaze calmly. I've spent my life being examined. This isn't new. They stepped into the terminal. Television screens flashed headlines. Commentators speculated. Analysts gestured at charts. None of them captured the quiet moments that had shifted everything. Outside the windows, the planes remained grounded, their shadows stretching across the concrete as the sun dipped lower. Time moved on, systems adjusted, paper trails multiplied. Daniel Harper walked forward without hurry, knowing that the pause he had forced was temporary, but the questions it raised would not be so easily dismissed. And somewhere between the noise of outrage and the silence of reflection, an industry had been compelled to look at itself without flinching. The hearing room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner, the kind of neutral scent meant to erase memory. It didn't work. Daniel Harper sat at the long table with his hands folded loosely in front of him, jacket draped over the back of his chair. No counsel at his side. Not because he didn't have one, but because this was not a trial he intended to outsource. Across from him, under flat overhead lights, sat a row of people who had spent their careers believing control came from preparation. A clock on the wall ticked, loud, intentional. Miss Holloway entered last. She did not look at Daniel right away. She took her seat, adjusted a stack of papers that had already been arranged, then finally lifted her eyes. This session is now on the record. The room stilled. Daniel felt the weight of it settle, not on his shoulders, but on the air itself. Records had permanence. That was the point. Miss Holloway cleared her throat. Mr. Harper, thank you for appearing on short notice. Daniel inclined his head. I expected the call. A murmur passed among the committee members. Expectation made people uneasy. We are here to determine whether Liberty Skies Airlines failed to uphold its contractual and ethical obligations to passengers. Miss Holloway continued. And whether those failures constitute a pattern of discriminatory enforcement. She paused. Your experience triggered this review. It did not create it. Daniel nodded. That distinction matters. A man to Ms. Holloway's left leaned forward. We've reviewed preliminary data. Seating reassignment complaints over the past 7 years show statistical irregularities. Irregularities, Daniel repeated quietly. The man stiffened. Disparities, better. Another committee member spoke, a woman with tired eyes and a legal pad filled edge to edge. Mr. Harper, do you believe this was intentional discrimination? Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had learned to do when the wrong answer could flatten nuance. I believe intent is often irrelevant to outcome, he said. Systems don't need malice to cause harm. They only need permission. The woman nodded slowly, writing. Ms. Holloway folded her hands. You are aware that several employees have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Daniel's gaze did not flicker. I am. Including frontline staff. Daniel inhaled, then exhaled. Accountability cannot stop at policy language, but it also should not end with scapegoats. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. You're walking a fine line, the man with glasses said. Daniel met his eyes. Lines exist whether we name them or not. The clock ticked on. A screen at the far end of the room flickered to life, displaying a timeline. Dates, routes, annotations. Patterns emerging where coincidence once lived. Ms. Holloway gestured toward it. This review may lead to regulatory penalties, leadership restructuring, and mandatory retraining across the organization. Daniel nodded once. Necessary measures often look disruptive before they look effective. The woman with the legal pad hesitated, then asked, Why did you refuse to move seats? The question landed softer than the others, more human. Daniel's voice lowered. Because I recognized the moment, the quiet one, the one where compliance teaches a system it can keep going. Silence followed. Not the heavy silence of tension, but the focused kind. Listening. Outside the hearing room, news anchors filled airwaves with speculation. Inside, something quieter and more dangerous was happening. Clarity. Ms. Holloway leaned back slightly. Mr. Harper, are you prepared for the consequences of this process? Daniel's reply was immediate. I prepared for the cost of silence years ago. The committee exchanged looks. We will reconvene after a brief recess, Ms. Holloway said. Please remain available. Chairs scraped, papers gathered. The room emptied in stages, leaving Daniel alone with the ticking clock and the screen still glowing with data that no longer needed interpretation. He closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, in remembrance. He thought of his father, bent over blueprints at a kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. Of his mother, counting receipts twice because someone else's mistake had once cost her a job. Of every moment when standing firm had seemed impractical until it wasn't. The door opened quietly. Claire stepped inside. She looked smaller out of uniform, hair pulled back hastily, hands clasped in front of her. I wasn't sure if I was allowed in here. Daniel opened his eyes. You're here as a witness. She swallowed. They asked me to give a statement. Daniel nodded. And did you? Yes. Her voice trembled, then steadied. I told them about the training, about the unofficial guidance, about the looks we got when we questioned it. Daniel studied her face. And how do you feel? She hesitated. Terrified? Relieved? Both? Daniel offered a small nod. That's what change feels like at first. She let out a breath she'd been holding for years. They might fire me. Daniel's gaze was steady. Or they might protect you. Both outcomes will teach the system something. Claire nodded slowly. Thank you. She left as quietly as she had entered. Daniel stood and walked to the window at the end of the room. Beyond it, the airport sprawled,
unusually still. Aircraft parked in unnatural alignment. People moving without the usual urgency. A pause large enough to notice. His phone buzzed once. A message from James Keller. Stock halted. Board emergency session underway. Daniel typed a brief reply. As expected. He returned to the table just as the door opened again. Ms. Holloway re-entered alone. "Mr. Harper," she said, closing the door behind her. "Off the record." Daniel met her gaze. "For now." She exhaled. "The board is considering asking for your advisory involvement moving forward." Daniel did not respond. She continued, "Not as an operator, as a conscience." Daniel's lips pressed together briefly. "Conscience cannot be contracted." Ms. Holloway nodded.
"I thought you might say that." She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "This process will cost people their jobs. It will also save others from losing theirs in ways they never understood." Daniel's voice was calm. "Then it's already doing its work." Ms. Holloway studied him for a long moment. "You changed the conversation." Daniel shook his head. "The conversation was already there. I just refused to leave the room." She nodded once and turned to go. As the door closed behind her, Daniel sat back down, hands folding once more. The hearing would resume. More questions would come, more resistance, more data. But the hardest part had already passed. Not the refusal, the reckoning that followed. Outside, the clock kept ticking, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it was moving in the right direction. The first plane to move did not take off. It rolled back from the gate slowly, deliberately, as if the airport itself needed to remember how motion worked after a day of forced stillness. Daniel Harper watched from a glass corridor overlooking the runway. His reflection stared back at him, older than it had been a week ago. Not in years, but in weight. The hearing had ended hours earlier. Not with applause, not with a verdict that fit neatly into headlines. It ended with signatures, timelines, and obligations that would stretch far beyond any single news cycle. Behind him, voices moved through the terminal with a different cadence now. Less frantic, more careful. People spoke as if aware that systems could hear them again. James Keller approached quietly, holding 2 paper cups. Black coffee, no sugar. He offered one without a word. Daniel took it. "Thank you." James leaned against the railing beside him. Corporate issued the statement an hour ago. Full cooperation, independent oversight, interim leadership. The usual language, but this time backed by teeth. Daniel nodded. Language matters when it's enforced. James hesitated. "Karen Mills resigned this morning." Daniel did not react outwardly. "Voluntary." James nodded. "She said she didn't want to be remembered as a footnote. Said she finally understood what she had been defending." Daniel sipped the coffee. Change often begins with shame. What matters is what follows. James glanced out at the runway. The stock will recover, slowly. Some executives won't. A few careers are done. Daniel's voice was steady. Institutions survive by sacrificing individuals when necessary. The goal is to make sure the sacrifice leads somewhere better. James looked at him. "You could have pushed harder, taken more control." Daniel met his gaze. Power that announces itself invites resistance. Power that holds its ground invites reflection. A boarding announcement echoed faintly in the distance. Not Liberty Skies. Another airline. Another routine. Life continuing, but altered in subtle ways that would not show up on balance sheets. Claire crossed the terminal floor toward them. No uniform now, just a simple jacket and slacks. She stopped a few feet away, uncertain. Mr. Harper. Daniel turned. Claire. She took a breath. They offered me a position in training. Ethics liaison. It's new. They said it was because of my statement. Daniel nodded once. And how do you feel about that? Terrified, she admitted. And ready. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Then you're exactly who should do it. She smiled, small but real. Thank you for not letting it go quiet. Daniel watched her walk away, her steps more confident than the day before. Systems changed slowly. People changed one decision at a time. Outside, a Liberty Skies aircraft finally pushed back from its gate. The logo caught the afternoon sun, bright and unremarkable. It looked the same as it always had. That, Daniel knew, was the point. Real change rarely announced itself with new colors. His phone buzzed. A message from his office. Oversight committee seated. First compliance report due in 30 days. Media requests pending. Daniel typed a short reply. Proceed. James glanced at him. You're not done. Daniel shook his head. No, but I'm finished with this part. They stood in silence for a moment, watching ground crews move with renewed purpose, as if aware that eyes were now trained not just on results, but on process. Across the terminal, Robert and Elaine Whitaker passed by quietly, unremarkable among the crowd. They did not look at Daniel. Their story had ended differently than they expected, not in punishment, but in irrelevance. Privilege loses its power the moment it stops being invisible. Daniel finished his coffee and set the cup down. Somewhere, another meeting would begin. Another memo. Another argument over phrasing. That was the cost of momentum. He turned to James. People will forget the details. James frowned. Won't they? Daniel looked back at the runway. They'll forget the names. They won't forget the pause. James nodded slowly. Daniel walked toward his gate. Not first class this time. Not economy either. Just a seat. Assigned. Honored. The way it should have been all along. As he reached the boarding door, the agent scanned his pass. The chime sounded clean and final. Welcome aboard, Mr. Harper. Daniel inclined his head and stepped forward without ceremony. The aircraft door closed behind him. The engines spooled up. Somewhere beyond the glass, the day continued, altered in ways that would not be obvious to everyone, but would matter deeply to those who had learned to see. Change did not arrive as a victory. It arrived as a responsibility, carried forward by people who refused to move when moving would have been easier. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words. Stand your ground.